Welcome back to Levity Books Reviews. My name is Liam and I hope you're reading well. Today we're talking about Longing and Other Stories by the Japanese author Jun'ichirō Tanizaki. This is the first English translation of this Japanese author's confessional stories, and I think these are really important, and by the end of this video you should realize why. If you're at all interested in reading this book, it will be released on January 4th, 2022. I was super lucky because I got to read it on my Kindle through NetGalley. Thank you NetGalley and thank you Columbia University Press for allowing this copy. It was really good. And I want to say here that this particular translation is very smooth, it's very readable, it's very well edited, so kudos to the team that worked on this. So getting to the book, Longing and Other Stories is a collection of 3 stories which vary in their style, length, and themes, but they all have a common theme of a boy's faltering relationship with his family. The boy that is featured in these 3 stories we are to believe is Tanizaki himself, but at different ages. In the first story it is a young boy, in the second story it is a teen, and in the third story it is a young man. The first story, called Longing, was a wonderful 5-star experience for me. It reads so dreamlike or oniric, that word I'll never really use in any other context. It was the most dreamlike story I've ever read. There's this very strange thing that goes on in dreams where you can't really tell where you are or why things are happening, and it's quite hard to communicate that in writing, and somehow Tanizaki does it so with such minimalism and such clear focus to the way everything. When I was reading it, it felt like it was in black and white. It felt like it was happening in black and white, like dreams sometimes do. It's a very short story, but it's executed so well that it made me cry. It's a story about a young boy who is lost, searching for his mother at night. The second story, The Sorrows of Heretic, is an uncomfortable but well-written read. It's a story about a teenager who just generally disrespects his family, his friends. He has a sister who is dying of consumption, and his family are generally in poverty as well. It reminded me a lot of the film Parasite, which strangely I didn't like. Everyone loves it, but this isn't a film review channel, we're not going to go there. But I believe this story is the birth of an anti-hero in Japanese literature. I think it's very profoundly important to our cultural view of how Japanese literature is and the Japanese values are in fiction. This story reminded me a lot of Notes from Underground, and the translator even says this at the end of the book, and I was like, yes, like I saw that thing that you saw too. But I'd give this story a 3-star because, as important as it is, it's kind of hard to get on board with such an anti-hero. The third and final story, The Story of an Unhappy Mother, was a psychologically disturbing story about a widow who mistreats her family, and it's so different in style from the first 2. There's like so much variety in the way that Tanizaki writes about his own life in these 3 stories that it really shows how he develops as a writer through time. And when you compare this with someone like Marcel Proust in In Search of Lost Time, the way that he could change his style so much when writing stories about himself is quite interesting and unique. Most writers will stick to a certain way, especially when writing about themselves, because it's just so close to them. They want to be as true and real to themselves, whereas here he's showing very different perspectives in these stories. And The Story of an Unhappy Mother felt like a horror story, and trigger warning, there is a strong reference of suicide. So it's just a strange way to end this collection, although it makes sense chronologically. You just have this sudden plunge. I gave this 3-star because, again, it was very well structured and paced, but it was just a little extreme for me. These 3 stories clearly aren't strictly autobiographical because details within them make it inconsistent. The number of family members and the relationships between the family members vary too considerably for us to consider, even as readers, if these were fictional stories, that this was a continuation. But there is something about the way this collection is made that it does make you automatically feel like this is talking about the same thing, just chronologically this is a series. As a side note, these stories were written around 1910 and 1920, which was just before Yukio Mishima's active period, and he lists Tanizaki as an influence, and I can very clearly see that. This writing does seem very similar to Mishima in there is, again, the use of shadows and this repressed sense of violence and eroticism that I see very strongly and distinctly in Mishima's writing. I also think the date at which these stories were written is important for historical context. I think in the West we often associate the birth of existential philosophy and fiction as the decline of the church. Famously, when Nietzsche pronounced God is dead, people often see that as the sign that existential fiction would emerge, and with that the anti-hero came into modernist and postmodern fiction. But we rarely consider whether the same thing that happened in the West also happened in the East, and whether it would happen under the same context. The translator suggests that the main character of the second story, Sorrows of a Heretic, is challenging traditional Buddhist and Confucian values about family and how to respect one's elders and how to respect one's birth family before one's marital family. And I feel this book could be the birth, or at least part of the birth, of the anti-hero in Eastern literature. And I think it's important to recognize that the anti-hero as a literary device was developing in Japan before the World Wars, but it wasn't related to this decline of Christianity which we often attribute it to in the West. Reading this book has made me reevaluate whether the way we think about literature in America and Europe, and just generally in the West, might be culturally biased in a way that we always attribute a certain type of writing to something that's happened in our countries, whereas maybe it's a global thing. I find it alarmingly coincidental that Japanese literature and Western European literature and American literature would all be having existential fiction and existential philosophy phases at the same time, just before the World Wars, when there were no translations and there was limited accessibility. There was no cultural crosstalk going on. Anyways, so in conclusion, Longing in Other Stories is a fantastic introduction for anyone looking for Japanese modernist fiction, and it also gives the background of one of its greatest authors. I hope you like it. Coming out next January. Happy reading.